Wow, what an intro. Thank you. I was born in England, but my parents are not English, so I feel in some sort of crossover zone. So it's funny to hear somebody say that I'm nice because I'm British. So I'm going to talk to you today about Voice UI, and I'm going to kind of give you some big picture stuff, but then I'm going to get super practical, and I'm going to do the very foolhardy thing of doing a live demo in front of you guys. Okay, now I want to begin with a question. I'll read you this quote. There is only one condition in which we can imagine managers not needing subordinates and masters not needing slaves. This condition would be that each instrument could do its own work at the word of command or by intelligent anticipation. Now, put your hand up if you think that quote is 50 years old. 100. 200. 500. 1,000. Not so many hands going up. Okay. 2,000. Okay. Older? Okay. So the person who said this was actually Aristotle. Maybe we have some classic students. So the dream of speaking to machines is a lot older than you might think. And it seems like today, maybe some of that reality is becoming true, with the Amazon Echo, Alexa, and the Google Assistant. And I know you don't have it yet, so I have no idea sort of how familiar you are with these devices. But I know that you'll probably get both this year. So hopefully, you'll start to build up a bit more experience in these things. But I want to just throw out a quick question. I have a video of one of Amazon's Alexa promos. Who has actually, just put your hand up if you've played with one, like you've actually seen it live. Okay, mostly. I'm actually going to skip this video if you're very familiar, because this is just for beginners. So I'm just going to skip this one.
All you have to do is that.
Skip. Thanks. Okay, so the thing to know about the market is it's growing like crazy. Most countries that have had it for a while, the growth was incredible last year. So we're looking at a future where by 2020 in the US, possibly over half of US households will have one. So it's going to become a massive part of everyday life. But as I said, this is not a new dream. In fact, in terms of technology, the first voice interface was Audrey in the 1950s, a system that was the size of a house, and it could recognize 10 numerals spoken by only one person. But I suspect many of us who've used Voice UI historically, I think it kind of feels a bit like this. It's messy, it hasn't worked very well, and kind of deep learning and AI has really changed the game. And because it's so messy, I just kind of want to play you this clip from a movie that I find really interesting. It's a sort of design fiction video called Curious Rituals. I'll talk about it afterwards.
Call Gerardo.
Name unknown.
Call Gerardo.
Name unknown.
Call Gerardo.
Calling Gerardo.
Hello?
Hey Gerardo, did you call?
Yeah, are we still on for coffee?
Yeah, I will be there.
I'm running a little late, but we'll be there by noon.
Okay.
Where are you?
Oh.
Call ended.
Call Gerardo.
Calling Gerardo.
Okay. So any of us have used Voice UIs, we've sort of had these moments. Now, the reason Curious Rituals is interesting is because it's a film about the future as mundane. It's called The Future Mundane, this concept where actually the future that Apple and Microsoft would sell us is, interacting with fucking graphs on your fridge, but actually the reality is no, it breaks, the future is broken, and that's particularly true of voice because it's so sensitive to the environment. It's much more sensitive than our other modes of input because of sound, the environment, our social context, dealing with accents or different languages, which is why it's being so slow to release here. So it's very sensitive voice. And so if you take one thing away from my talk, it is merely this. Our job as designers and creators of these things is to make them fail gracefully. Because we've all used these systems and had them fail, and that will continue to happen no matter how good the technology is. So that's our mission, really, as creators. But let's talk now about sort of possible futures. Where do people think this is going? Well, let's, for the moment, take a look at Amazon's growth strategy. Here are all the things that Amazon's Alexa is being built into at the moment, right? So what Amazon are doing is they're commoditizing the tech to put Alexa into things whereby in the near future, you might buy a piece of electronics, it'll have Alexa in it, and you won't even realize. Like, you might not realize that when we buy it because they've commoditized that tech to such a low price point that everything will start speaking at some point, maybe. It's kind of a weird future. So we're facing this future where our home devices may talk by default. I think it's kind of odd. And what's behind that? Well, it's this idea of Ubicomp, or ubiquitous computing, invisible everywhere computing that does not live on a personal device of any sort, but is in the woodwork everywhere. Sort of late 80s, early 90s, this guy Mark Weiser and a team came up with this idea. So there's a movie that gets this really right, called Her. Quick show of hands, who's seen it? A few. I'll just play a clip from it. So in this scene, the protagonist has recently upgraded his voice assistant.
Hey, you just got an email from Mark Lumen.
What are you talking about?
Read email.
Okay, I will read email for Theodore Twombly.
I'm sorry. What's Lumen say?
Theodore, we missed you last night, buddy. Don't forget it's your goddaughter's birthday on the 29th. Also, Kevin and I had somebody we wanted you to meet. So, we took it upon ourselves to set you up on a date with her. Next Saturday, she's fun and beautiful, so don't back out. Here's her email. Wow. This woman is gorgeous. She went to Harvard, she graduated magna cum laude in computer science, and she was on the Lampoon. So that means she's funny and she's brainy.
So did everyone catch the fact that she made fun of him there when he used his robotic voice? So when you get an Amazon Echo, if you ever do, you'll find that you actually do start changing your speech. And what I find very interesting about any technology we take on is, who does it turn us into, right? That's one of the most interesting questions. So notice how here, this is an incredibly thoughtful film in terms of how design is presented. They've really, really designed a lot of the UI details. So it's multimodal, right? That's the first thing about it. There's this beautiful dance going on between the modes. So when we talk about ubiquitous computing, we probably shouldn't talk about voice in isolation, right? We've got this multimodal thing going on. He starts interactions with voice, or she starts interactions with voice. That's a really important thing, that voice may not be the ideal thing to end up using, but it is the ideal thing to start with, because it's very easy to express your intention that way. It's ever present, it's all around you. And I guess my personal interest in voice is how we can become, I guess, a bit more, have our attention back, be a bit more present in our lives. I like to think of my smartphone as the precious. You know, I keep reaching for it in my pocket, you know. And I think the reason I like Voice UI is it maybe allows us to be a little bit more human in our lives. Now, having talked about the future of this stuff and shown you some, you know, crazy AI, let's get real. We don't actually know what intelligence is. So a voice assistant like that, it's an unknown period of time away. Deep learning, great. AI, great, yeah. But we don't have a working good definition of intelligence. We don't know how our own works, so I'm not sure how soon we will replicate it. And I would argue that in terms of the intelligence and the way we use voice, that really lots of people are looking for certainty, but nobody knows where the fuck this is going. And so, you know, I think we're in a period of time where we need to sort of play around and experiment a lot. And I hope teams are not put under too much commercial pressure when they start playing with this stuff, because it's important that we have time to play and learn. But I do want to give you some opportunity lenses for how you might use voice when it becomes ever present in people's homes, as I'm sure it will. So go look at your user journey. Like, what's your user research telling you about where the use cases for voice might be in someone's journey? Go listen to conversations, right? How are people speaking to your customer service agents right now? And what kind of conversations do people want to have? Then something that's doing very well in the app ecosystem right now is just the creative fun stuff. So lots of the most successful Echo skills, they're called, they're not called apps, are actually just really fun things. You know, this famous American game show called Jeopardy is, you know, one of the most fun things. Or my friend Tom created this thing, a very popular game called Would You Rather. So, you know, so would you rather eat snake or, you know, take an ice bath? It just, for some reason, this is a really popular voice app. And then start thinking about, you know, what the possible futures are. So I personally use this thing called the futures wheel. It's a workshop method which you can read about. It's a really interesting way of sort of trying to connect some trends and see what happens. So if you're thinking about what the commercial use cases are or what use voice might have, these are 4 kind of ways into this. But probably my next talk is going to be about how we use it in more detail strategically. I want to do a sort of reality check about Voice UI. Most of what you see in the ecosystem is what we call command and control. Conversational UI has a lot of hype around it at the moment because of things like WeChat in China. But actually, most of it is not very conversational. Most of it is issuing a one-off command, you know, like Alexa, play me some black metal on Spotify, you know. So, you know, that kind of thing is just a one-off command. The system doesn't need to speak back to you. There doesn't need to be much of a conversation around that. But hey, you know, that's what it's like. And also, there's a lot, what I've encountered is a lot of kind of wishful thinking about the reality of Voice UI in our home settings. So let's just think about, let's say you're going to design something for kids, right? You start thinking, okay, well, we're going to make something fun. It's going to be for kids. They're going to play it in groups. But then when you actually start to put a group of kids in a room with one of these devices, you realize the whole thing falls apart because it's too noisy and the system cannot recognize who is speaking. That's certainly true with my kids. As soon as there's more than 2 of them, the idea is dead in the water, because the reality is that the settings that we put Voice UI into are incredibly messy. You know, I talked about this earlier, but there's this academic paper that Stuart Reeves was one of the authors of, and he said, real-world, complex yet highly ordered multi-activity settings are the norm and remain a serious technical and design challenge for voice interfaces. This is the world that voice interfaces are going into. And when you read the paper, what you realize is that it's not one-to-one conversations as Amazon would have us believe, or Apple, you know, or Google, right? Basically, in our home settings, there's like 4 conversations going on at once often, right? Different if you live on your own, of course. But basically, in a lot of home settings, the environment is far too complex for the voice interface to cope with. And so we need to kind of keep this in mind and get real about this stuff. Another important thing is just how much Voice UI relies on memory. So if you think about using most of the UI via a screen, actually you don't need to remember what the app was called. You possibly don't even need to remember exactly what it does or what it doesn't do. You don't need to remember which bit of your smartphone it was on, which menu, right? Because actually all the stuff that helps you refine it and figure out what it does is already there in front of you. It persists. Now, in Voice UI, that's not true. So let's just take maybe something that might happen in future here, right? Alexa, ask Finnair if the flight from London to Helsinki is on time. Now, the things I've emboldened are the things that you actually have to remember when you're using the Voice UI. And this is actually pretty hard, right? So Alexa, okay, you might think, oh, that's an easy one to remember if you have an Amazon Echo. I have 3 voice assistants at home, and I frequently mistake them. Okay, Google, oh, no, shit, no. Oh, Alexa, no, oh, shit. So I'm speaking to the wrong one. Okay, maybe I'm not normal and I don't have 1 system at home, I have 3. But that's something I have to remember. Which one am I speaking to, right? Okay, ask Finnair. Oh, okay, which thing did I install, or which system is it that I need to speak to that can tell me when the planes are landing? Okay, maybe I don't quite remember. That's not working very well at the moment. And then also this thing you have to design for, which is, okay, how exactly should they say it? And how smart is our system going to be in order to recognize all the variations that they're going to say? So it relies a lot on memory. It has no affordance, as we say in design, or it has low affordance. And at the moment, if you have one of these devices, Amazon sends you an email on a Friday reminding you of things to try. It's an incredibly crude method of reminding you what a device can do, and I mostly just delete it and don't read it. So this is one of the big design problems. In fact, this is playing out in the commercial ecosystem. This article's a bit old now, but Alexa and Google Assistant have a problem. People aren't sticking with the voice apps they try. So my warning to you is if you're going to design something that's infrequently used, it's probably dead in the water. It has to be something that people will use regularly or hooks them back in somehow. So another really important detail about voice is that it is low bandwidth. using voice input is great because it's faster than typing, but listening to voice output is hard because it's slower than reading. So earlier on, I played you that clip of her, and she actually read out an email. Reading out somebody's email is pretty nuts because he could have taken in the information much faster if she just flashed it up on screen. I mentioned this voice first thing. I want to just do a comparison with GUIs, right? So when we use a graphical user interface, we kind of start at a home point, and then we express our intention to the system via a series of steps or actions, right? So it's like a tree system down to the thing that we really want to do. And voice is a bit more like this. You express the intention up front, and then you sort of refine and negotiate with the system. So the interactions have a different shape. The other thing is, think about, you know when you use like a voice interaction on the phone traditionally, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, and it was awful, right? It was broken. Well, why does that feel so wrong? It's because human conversation is literally an ancient tool. We've been doing it possibly for hundreds of thousands of years. We've been using computers for what? 50, 40 maybe in widespread use, less than that even. So we expect so much more from human conversation, actually. And this is why when it breaks, it feels really, really wrong. So you have to kind of really design for natural conversation and manage those expectations a lot. Another thing about voice is that really the heart of building it and designing for it is great writing. And I don't mean great writing in a sense of like, you know, I'm Hemingway or it's necessarily engaging. I mean just in terms of it being concise and clear and really connecting with someone's understanding of what the system is up to. Okay, let's talk. How much time have I got? All right, we're doing good. Let's talk about actually designing for voice. And I was sort of watching the ecosystem over the past few years. I got my first Echo about 2.5 years ago. And looking at what was going on and what was being built. And, you know, it's this kind of, we're still in the kind of Wild West period. Somebody at Google recently said it's like the early days of the web. I think it kind of is. It's a bit messy. And there's this particular thing that I want to point out to you. Okay, so there is an app in the store, in the skills store, that helps you to remember your keys when you leave home. Now, you have to talk to it to get it to remind you to take your keys. Can anyone tell me what the flaw in that design is? And I was just trying to imagine what was going on in this developer's mind. Like, what problem are you solving here? Because I don't understand. And there's a lot of stuff out there that's just completely useless shit. It does not consider the use case properly. Hey, I love that there's loads of these experiments out there. Honestly, I wouldn't take them away. But I've noticed there's this thing. I'm a hacker too. I'm not just a designer. I've built things with my Raspberry Pi at home. And what I've noticed is that when it's easy to create, we start building and we forget to design. So all these tools in voice are actually emerging. Like it's really easy to use Google's Dialogflow to start prototyping conversations right now. But the easier it gets, the kind of more frivolous the stuff we do becomes and the less considered it is. So my advice to you is just watch out. Yeah, it's great. I love that it's easy to build, but there's a warning in there about like how you should slow down and kind of consider carefully whether you're designing for the right use cases and so on. Now, the company I just literally left a week ago, after 6 years there, is called ClearLeft. And in 2007, we created something called Silverback, which for many years was the market leader in usability testing, as used by the Obama campaign and NASA. And it really kind of changed the market because before that point, usability testing was very expensive to do. It was Moray, this thing that cost like $2,000. And we made it like really cheap, like 40 quid, I think it was, like 40 pounds, to just get into a cafe and do usability testing. So we kind of, in some ways, democratized the practice of testing things. And so it's very deep in the DNA of the company I worked for to kind of find these cheap ways to kind of test and try things out. And I love this quote by John Mader. He said, "If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings." If you are talking to stakeholders about voice interfaces and building an Alexa skill, honestly, just make something. It's really not that difficult. Like, that's the way we should be organizing our work, is around these artifacts. John was talking about that earlier. Okay, so what what is the equivalent, like in Voice UI, to kind of a quick and dirty prototype that you test? Well, you may or may not have heard of this practice, but I'm going to show it to you today. It's called Wizard of Oz testing. So this is actually a fairly old practice. Jeff Kelly, I think at Stanford, invented this in the late 70s. And it's called the experimenter in the loop, where you're essentially just faking the machine. It's a research experiment in which subjects interact with a computer system that subjects believe to be autonomous, but which is actually being operated or partially operated by an unseen human being. So when you actually kind of do this, you sort of create this dance, right? So you have messy human input, like what they say to it in response, and then you iterate how the system responds to that response, and you iterate really quickly through that. And Jeff Kelly's idea was fascinating. You know, he was doing like rapid prototyping, you know, in the late 70s, really early on. He said, we've got to get the design 90% right before a line of code is written. Great ambition, and very much in line with the way I think. Although I will say one thing about that. Organizations that I work with recently have been fetishizing the design sprint. I have been trained at Google with some of the people that created the design sprint process, and I love it, and I do use it, and I preach it, but honestly, organizations are getting a bit too in love with it. There are lots of problems that cannot be solved with design sprints, and I really want to remind everybody of that. Anyway, moving on. I was in Chicago a little while ago, and I had this idea based on talking to a friend of mine at Google, Abby Jones. And the idea was, could I go from an idea for a voice interface to a test, like try it out in under an hour? Oh, that's the real Edward Hopper, by the way. So again, it was sort of in line with Silverback, what I was talking about earlier, right? So like, how quickly could we find out that we're wrong? So I'm now going to do that. And not the whole process. I'll just show you a bit of it. So demo time. For this, I am going to need a volunteer. Who's feeling brave today? Just one. It's really easy. It's not a big deal. You, sir, please come up. Can we have a round of applause? What's your name?
Jakob.
Jakob. Okay. Actually, could you stand over here? Is that, actually, yeah, maybe down there, actually. Sorry. There's a reason I need you not to look at the screen. So we're going to pretend today that this is an Amazon Echo. And Jakob's going to talk to it right here. Okay, so if you can just not look at the screen while we do this is great. So what's happening here? So what you see here, this is actually a Wizard of Oz tool that I created. It's like 15 lines of Python. It's a very crude tool. And it takes a text file with the responses that I want the system to have. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to push the keys on the keyboard that read out these lines, and Jakob is going to interact with the system, and I'm going to be the system. Okay? So in a moment, I'm going to read you a brief. Okay? And then you can just talk to it any way you'd like. All right, here we go. So you're at work. You've got a meeting for an hour, and you'd like to capture the audio of the meeting room and all the people speaking and listen back to it later. So ask Alexa to do this.
Recording started. How long is your meeting?
1 hour.
1 hour. Okay. Who would you like me to send the recording to?
Me.
What's your full name? Me. Thanks. Afterwards, I'll send this recording to you.
Round of applause for Jakob. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so that is the result of a lot of iteration, right? This is not the first script that I put together for this idea. I think it's been iterated maybe 20 or 30 times, and frequently at events it goes wrong, which is kind of a good thing. I learned something new about what does and doesn't work in the script. Okay, back to my presentation. So the whole idea really is that I've tried a lot of the prototyping tools for voice are out there, and none of them are as quick as editing a text file. So my tool still has some use, even though the prototyping tools are kind of getting more useful. And people at Amazon and the BBC and various other organizations like KLM have come and learned these methods and have started to use things like this to do the early stages, to figure out the plausibility and the usability of your early ideas. And of course, you know design is working when it kills your early ideas. And lots of the people in my workshop yesterday found this out the hard way, which is the point, right? Now, my advice about designing is really to kind of find your question. Start with a single question. Identify that single use case which is most important to you, that is useful in a hands-free context. Let's talk a little bit about the design process. I'm just going to flash this up. I'm not going to talk in detail about loads of these. The first thing to do is establish the case and the context of use. And often this should kill your idea. Oh, that thing I have in mind doesn't work in the context that my users are in, and this is therefore of little use. Okay, great. But maybe something survives, maybe something's interesting. Then you're going to craft the personality of the thing you're building, right? Because if you think about Alexa, one moment it might be reminding an elderly person to take their medicine, and in the next moment it's playing games with kids. So you really have to think about how it expresses your brand and the personality. So what would it say? What would it not say? What sort of feelings do you want it to evoke? Is it casual? Is it formal? Is it dealing with a situation that's highly error-prone in which users would not want to be joked around with? Or can you introduce playfulness? And the thing about that is that if you don't think about the personality of your bot or of your system, users will they'll just think of one. If you don't design it, and if it's bland, that's what they'll think of your brand. So then you're going to just write sample dialogue, which is what you saw from that text file. Just figure out, like, what's the 80%? How do we imagine that these conversations or these commands are going to work? And then you're going to do Wizard of Oz testing, which I showed you. And then this process called dialogue flow, where you kind of do some mapping out, more traditional UX processes. You say, okay, well, these are all the things it needs to do. Here's the help state, the error state. You kind of do lots of work to figure out the different moving parts of the system. And then you build, test, and launch. And of course, this is actually the point where you really learn what's going on, because all these people start saying things to it that you hadn't anticipated. This is where the real work begins. Now, I was thinking a lot about like how to make it easy to design in these early days, right? And so I put together this mega list called Voice Guidelines, where I just literally took all the kind of guidelines and design principles that I could find and put them all into a single page. So if you've got any inclination to work on this stuff, go look at this website. It just puts all the guidance from IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple. It's all in one place. Hopefully, it will be maintained over time, and it'll just become a really, really useful resource. Now, I'm just going to talk about one of those principles today, and an interesting feature of the way we converse, which I haven't really talked about too much. But if you're interested in this, you need to start to understand conversation. Conversation feels incredibly natural and normal to us, but the reality is it's an incredibly complex, evolved process, and it's very, very, very difficult when you actually get into sort of designing this stuff. So I want to talk about something called Implicature. What are they saying but not saying? Less of an issue in your culture than it is in mine. British people are notorious for not actually saying what they really mean. And I kind of hate this. My family's Dutch, right? So I really, really dislike that. I prefer the authenticity. But there are really simple situations, I'm sure even in Finnish, where what somebody says has a different implication to the words they use. So let's just try one of these, and I'll use a principle, one of the key principles for designing for voice, which is being brief, or brevity, as we say in English. So let's just take one really simple thing. So when is the next train to Helsinki? 13:05 from Espoo to Helsinki, leaves in 20 minutes. So I'll throw a question out to the room. What is the implication or the real meaning of that question? When is the next train to Helsinki? What does the user really need, or what are they really thinking about? Can they make it? Yes. Can I make it to the train on time? So not what's the actual time of the train is less important than do I have time to get there? And in fact, Google Assistant has recently been giving me better answers about this. Like, it recognizes that I need to know the walking time from my house to my local station. So let's talk about a little bit of information hierarchy here, and look at that sentence, a relatively brief sentence. I want you to imagine all of the data points that you could have given to a user about that train. Platform, price, number of carriages, how long the journey is going to be, or how many stops, or can I take my bike? Like, you could imagine probably hundreds of data points about that train. But because voice is low bandwidth, we have to pick the perfect way to convey the information back to the user. And that's why the leaves in 20 minutes is the end of the sentence, because that's what you want people to leave with. You have 20 minutes to get there. So you see, it seems like an obvious thing to design for, but it's a very subtle thing. And you need to be very mindful of what people actually need and actually mean in the questions. So here's some design resources for you. So I wrote this article called Shut the Fuck Up, Test Your Idea in 1 hour. I lay out the whole process that I showed you today. Say Wizard was the tool I used. And Amazon have only very recently released this thing called Blueprints, which is a wonderful way of prototyping some of the things you have in mind. And you can actually use an Amazon Echo, which of course is one of the next design steps, right? You want to test it in a more realistic context, right? You want to actually have people interact with an object and not a fake like mine. Bit of flagrant self-promo. I just left my job, so I have to do this, and I need the money. Let me help you. I did a workshop. I did a workshop yesterday. It was really fun. I had to be told that because you guys don't react terribly enthusiastically. Apologies, Finns, but you don't. And I'm consulting lots of organizations around Europe about how to design for voice and conversation and bots. And I love running workshops. So let me come and do this for your organizations or consult if you need it. Yeah. And then I just want to leave you with one last thought. And this is from Mark Reiser, the sort of the godfather, if you like, of ubiquitous computing. He said, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it." I can't really think of a better way to sum up how we might use voice in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Wow.
Thank you.
Are there any questions for Ben? Yes, please.
You mentioned that right now the conversations with Voice UI is very robot-like, so we ask direct questions and expect direct answers. But recently Google released this trailer of Google Duplex, where the conversation of the voice assistant was very, very human-like and very hard to detect that it was a computer. So do you think that in the future our human conversations will also become more robot-like, or will we go to a trend where Voice UI will become Google Duplex-like?
Yeah, that's such a deep and interesting question. Thank you for that. So they will become more natural, but the ethical questions that raises are really, really interesting. So I think it will become more natural, and we will start to lose our habit of using the robotic voice in order to be understood. But the truth about Duplex is, if you actually read about how they created it, it really isn't as idealistic as the way it was portrayed in that video. I'm sure it's incredibly smart, but if you go and read about how they trained it, honestly, there was an enormous amount of failure that we were not seeing as a part of that. The interesting question it raises is, should it be transparent to the person at the other end of the phone? And it may be that ethically and for the sake of maintaining trust in our society, right? So you have one of the highest levels of trust in the world, and that is why your society functions so damn well, right? Because people naturally trust each other. So do we destroy trust in each other if we don't know who we're talking to, whether it's a bot or a human? And that, for me, is the central question that it raises. I think it will become more natural, but I think, as my friend Chris Nassell, who's the author of Sci-Fi Interfaces, he's written a wonderful article about this recently. He was basically saying what we need is some sort of signal. We need transparency in those systems so we know we are speaking to a robot. Even if it's completely natural, it needs to be transparent. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'd like to comment that we have crossed that line with textual chatbots already.
Right, yeah, that people can't tell? Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I've worked on a few chatbot type projects where we had users not realizing that when it switched to a human that they were actually speaking to a human. yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks for an inspiring talk. I haven't used the voice interfaces much. Are they all modeled as single persona, or would there be benefit for because For example, I know that some of my friends or contacts are experts in one field or another. There was an earlier talk here about Rust, the programming language.
Yeah.
So if I would ask my programming friend about Rust, the programming language, and my boat owner friend about Rust in the marine environment, and for example, sort of utilize this in one way or another.
Yeah, so I think the platforms, Amazon and Google Assistant, are moving towards customizable voices. So John Legend was announced as the voice of Google Assistant. And Google, to answer your point about expertise, Google are doing a better job of sort of working with brands, right? So when you talk to the Google Assistant and you connect to what's called an action, so a discrete app from an organization, you get more control over how it speaks and its mode of expression. So you can say, oh yeah, I want a male voice for my brand, or I want this kind of voice. So they are doing they're slightly ahead in terms of saying, well, yeah, we should be able to switch voices out or have them expressed differently in different contexts. I mentioned, how should an elderly person how do they like to be spoken to, or who do they like to be spoken to? And in fact, people really want this. I was on American Public Radio a while ago, and the main question I got at the end from the public was, when can my voice assistant sound like Sean Connery? That came up a lot. So yeah, people do want that. You can understand why, from a brand point of view, they've stuck to one voice for a while, because they need people to get familiar with the mode of interaction before it starts switching voices out and so on. So I think we're definitely going that way. But again, there's lots of questions there about discovery, transparency. Is it confusing when it switches? Do I know who I'm speaking to? Is it for a different purpose? I think there's a lot of questions that we don't know the answer to yet.
My question sort of popped from the context of establishing context, and you said that you need to remember all kinds of things which are on a graphical user interface. You have all kinds of hints, but you have to remember everything. And people's brains are sort of geared towards talking to people and different people.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. Like, if I'm at work, should I speak to a voice assistant that helps me professionally with a different name to one at home? Yeah, I don't know the answer yet, but I think we'll see what happens. Yeah. And can I let somebody else ask a question, because you had a question already? Is that all right?
You spoke about how important it was to fail gracefully.
Yeah.
And I have an Alexa at home, and I find extremely frustrating when she doesn't understand what I'm saying or can't find something that I'm looking for. Yeah. What would be the ideal way for a voice interface to fail?
Yeah, so
that is not frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the use case, but the team that I think was doing kind of interesting things there is Cortana, which is not a very popular voice UI, but they were really clear that Cortana shouldn't act like a doormat, right? So when she can't do something, she's really clear about that, and you don't get used to this kind of constant failure, like, oh no, I can't do that, and that's okay. I mean, in terms of like specific responses, we saw earlier the Gerardo example, right? So which group of people designed that answer? Not to call out engineers. I love engineers. I used to be one, and I know lots of engineers who are great designers, but that is an engineering style response. So you could say, well, actually what the system should do is recognize that the user is in a repetitive loop and just suggest some other way of solving the problem. So actually in some of my other talks, I have suggestions like, hey, I've sent a Google search to your phone, or some other mode of interaction might be more appropriate here once it's failed twice, for example. Like, because this is, that loop is just completely unhelpful. Yeah.
Siri does something like that.
Yeah, she actually does. Like when you ask a question where she's got nothing in the knowledge bank, she'll say, okay, let me Google that for you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to prioritize the other ones.
Thanks for the great talk. You mentioned few of the cases when it fails, the voice interaction or this app with finding the keys. But can you give an example of ultimately cool case, like an app you helped to design or you have met that was actually helpful in the voice manner, better than any other UI?
So, well, in terms of the overall ecosystem, the stuff to look at, because people are using it and it's engaging and it's evolving, is actually games, weirdly, or meditation apps. It has built-in, like, it has a built-in habit to it, for example. Something I'm working on, which is testing very well at the moment, I won't say who it's for, but it's basically like tracking packages, right? So I'm at home, I've got deliveries coming in. Oh, where is that? When's it coming? That sort of thing. It's not in the ecosystem yet, but I'm super pleased with what we've done so far in it, and I cross fingers it's going to do awesome in the ecosystem. Yeah. Yeah. Do we have time? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Quick question. So, voice UIs are almost mostly in English, and we as Finns, we are a very small folk, so we can't expect a really good working voice UI in Finnish very soon, and because the languages are very difficult and the cultures are very difficult, and English has the advantage that there's tons and tons of more data and more tests done, and everything is done better. And I was thinking, will this result in a difference in technology cultures around the world? Because as Finns, we can't access a voice UI in Finnish as soon as in English, or as in German, or maybe Spanish. And that is why there will be a sort of difference in the future in technology that is otherwise pretty liberal.
Yeah. I guess this is one that's very specific to... it's interesting to think, at what point have platforms or new modes emerged and the internationalization created these divides that you're talking about? Off the top of my head, I don't know, but maybe, like, if we look at China versus... European smartphone usage, what difference in evolution would we see? So the reason, that obviously, that it's so slow is that those platforms want it to be really, really good before they launch, and it, as you know, it takes a long time to train the systems and to hit a certain level of maturity. In the UK, lots of stuff attached to my Amazon account. The fact that I have a UK Amazon account means there's loads of stuff in the US that I can't use. And it's kind of frustrating. So I'm already hitting that barrier. What you hope is that we'll plateau, right? Is that a 99%, we'll hit a 99% of languages, and then once we've solved the language problem across the world, then we can start building more reliable, more equal systems across the world that are easy to roll out in good time, for example. Yeah. Was there one at the back? Do we still have time? I have no idea. One more? Yeah. There was one near the back.
Hi. Would it be easier if the voice system would start the conversations, and why?
Would it be easier if the voice system started the conversation? It's not... So... Because it's so socially sensitive, the platforms are obviously very careful about being the initiator of anything at home. So there are these cases where the Amazon Echo said something at random at home, and then people got really freaked out, because that's not what they want. Like, it's a tool. I want it on demand to me. And for example, there's a big conversation in voice UI circles right now about notifications, because what we don't want to do is replicate the smartphone notification, right? We all know we've been bombarded with that shit, and we don't want anything like that at home when we're trying to relax or cook, right? So what we're talking about there is really kind of etiquette. I have a friend, Giles Colburn, in the UK, who does talks on voice UI and conversation as well. And what he says is that, like, actually a lot of what we're going to be designing for in the near future is like politeness. How do we take the context and the sensory data that we have and say, yes, this is a good time to talk to a user or to let them know about something, or what's the right level of discretion, or what works socially. So at the moment, I think we're in a stage where, let me give you an example. You remember when mobile phones were new, and if you saw someone using them, I'm old enough to remember that, unfortunately, I'm 40. So like, when that was a new thing, you looked at somebody using a phone, certainly in the UK, I don't know about here, and you went, oh, arsehole. Like, why do you think you're special enough to use a mobile phone, right? So when I first started using voice interfaces, my friends would come over and they'd never seen this stuff, and they would joke with me. They're like, you're the Borg now, Ben. And now they all own one, right? So we know this stuff is coming. A point will come when they do want to talk to us proactively. At the moment, I think the social stuff around it is not, we're not ready for it, and the systems aren't ready to know when they should talk to us in that way. That's my feeling, yeah. I think we're done.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. I really loved Helsinki, by the way. I love meeting you all.